Like me, it prances and dances and sings with glee. Wherever there's strife, the singer is there. He slaughters and slays.
Hello, welcome to Board with Paint. Today in our HeroQuest painting series, I'll be showing you how to paint the handsomest of all the orcs, the Bard, who came with the HeroQuest Mythic Tier. In order to match the skin tone of the orc monsters that I painted in a previous video, I'm starting off with a dry brush of titanium white over all of the skin. This is going to lay down the base for the slap chop method we'll be using to paint the skin. And then we'll cover the skin in a generous amount of Ghillie Dew from Army Painter Speedpaint. This isn't necessarily a speed painting tutorial. I'm only using the speed paint because I used the same color on the orcs and I wanted them to match. Next, there's a little bit of an undershirt that you can see under his hand here. I'm just covering this with Bony Matter Speed Paint just to get some color on it. I don't want to deal with highlighting it later, so this will be a simple way to get it covered. Now we'll proceed with some more traditional base coating with Ultramarine Blue for the pants. Next, I'm using Eldandil Violet for the hat and vest. For the light colored trim around the vest, I'm using Iraqi Sand as a base coat. I'm also using this to color the face of the loot. Now we'll base coat the boots in Mournfang Brown. I'm also using this color to paint all the other areas of leather on the miniature. So this is the belt and the straps around the chest. For the scabbard of the sword, I'm using German Camo Black Brown to get a darker leather look. And for the bottom of the loot, I'm using Citadel Dryad Bark. For the wooden part of the chest that he's standing on, I'm using Deathclaw Brown. The feather in his cap is getting Ishtar Pink from Scale Color. Here I'm painting the inside of the bard's mouth with brown rose. You could also use the Ishtar Pink for this if you have it out on your palette. And like the orcs in the previous monster video, I'm using Lilith Yellow for the eyes. Now I'm adding a little bit of color to the teeth by just grabbing some of the Iraqi Sand that was already on my palette. There's an alternating pattern on the handle of the sword. I'm doing half of it in Mournfang Brown. Now I'm going around the entire miniature and hitting anything that is silver with Leadbelcher by Citadel. On the loot, this includes the tuning pegs, the bridge, and the frets. The frets obviously are pretty small, so if you make the line a little too thick, go back in and clean it up with Iraqi Sand. I'm also using Leadbelcher to paint the handguard on the sword. Here I'm using Glorious Gold to paint the metal parts of the metal on his chest. Now I'm going and filling in the other parts of the handle of the sword with Slaughter Red from Army Painter Speedpaint. To pick out the details of the strings, I'm doing a black dry brush over the entire front of the lute. I'm trying hard just to keep this on the face of the instrument, making sure that paint gets picked up on each string. Now with some regular consistency black, I'm trying to fill in the sound hole. To lighten up the feather on the hat, I'm giving it a quick dry brush of titanium white. Here I'm mixing a little bit of black into the Leadbelcher and using this for the iron reinforcement around the outside of the chest. Now we'll move on to some highlights, starting with the pants. We'll begin by lightening the blue with some Fenrisian Grey. And now we'll apply this to any upward facing areas and folds in the fabric. Now we'll progressively make it lighter by adding some more Fenrisian Grey and going over those areas again, covering slightly less area this time. If you thin your paints down when highlighting, it can help ease some of the transitions and make those layer lines disappear. And here I'm continuing to lighten the mix a little bit more. And we're starting to push those highlights out to the edges and only on the tippy tops of the areas of fabric facing the sky. To help ease those transitions, I'm mixing some flow enhancer in with the base color, Ultramarine Blue, and I'm using this to sort of glaze over any of the transition areas between where we highlighted and where the base coat still is. This next step you can consider optional because it is a little bit fiddly, but we're going to try to paint the pinstripes onto the pants. I'm going back to the Eldandil Violet, which I used for the vest, and I'm getting it nice and thin with some flow enhancer, wicking off excess moisture on a paper towel, and just trying to draw those straight lines along the pants. The key here is to use a light touch and to go very slow, and it can also help to hold your breath while you're drawing the lines. I'm not really going for the exact same density of lines that are shown in the artwork because I think those would be too small and would probably clutter up the miniature. So I'm just going for 5 or 6 lines on each pant leg. Once you have the first one down, try to make each one parallel to it. This can obviously get a little bit tricky when the legs bend and whatnot. But if you don't like it, you can go back in with the base color and paint over it. If you still have the highlight gradient on your palette, that can be helpful in cutting in those lines and cleaning up after the fact. Now I'm mixing some Fenrisian Grey in with the purple, and I'm using this just to go over the lines where we're in the largest areas of highlight. Again, you can probably consider this an optional step. If you don't highlight the pinstripes, I don't think anyone will really notice. Now we'll highlight the lighter part of the vest by mixing some white in with the Iraqi Sand. We'll be covering most of the white parts with this, so just leave the bare Iraqi Sand in the recesses or on the lowest areas. Now we'll repeat this by putting a little bit more white into the mix and covering a slightly smaller area like we usually do with layering highlights. And here I'm going a tad lighter by adding some more white and doing it again. Now we'll highlight the jacket using the same colors we used for the pinstripes. This is Eldandil Violet mixed with some Fenrisian Grey. And here we'll do a second highlight by adding a little more gray. While we have this out, we also want to highlight the areas of the hat that are purple. And here I'm mixing in a little bit more gray for our third and final highlight. And just like we did on the pants, I'm taking the base color and thinning it down with some flow enhancer to make a glaze, and using this to go over the transition areas. Now we'll highlight the boots by mixing the Mournfang Brown with the Deathclaw Brown. The highlights here will go on the tips of the toes and around any of the edges to give it that worn leather look. We also want to be sure to highlight the straps and belt while we have this out. And you guessed it, another level of highlight by adding more Deathclaw Brown. And now our third highlight, I'm using pure Deathclaw Brown. Now I'm picking out the buttons on the vest with some pure black. Next, I'm highlighting the chest by mixing some white in with Deathclaw Brown and using this to highlight all the wooden areas. And some more white for a second highlight. And some more white for a third highlight. Next, I'll move on to highlighting the back of the loot with Dryad Bark mixed with some Iraqi Sand. As before, we'll do a couple other layers of highlights by adding some extra Iraqi Sand to the mix. Next, I'll exercise my ability to paint on camera and cover the inside of the mouth with Carroburg Crimson. Next, we'll pull out the Agrax Earthshade and cover all of the leather and wooden areas with this. When doing the chest, it's fine to get this on the metal parts as well. I'm being a little bit more selective on the boots and leather, just trying to get into the recesses and add a little bit more depth, but not covering the highlighted areas. I'm also shading the loot with this. Now I'm going to paint the fingernails with a mixture of Ghillie Dew and Lilith Yellow. These are basically just dots going at the end of the fingertips. Now we'll make a nice gray color and use this to highlight the buttons. Again, we're basically just using dots here. Next, we'll highlight the upper parts of the teeth by lightening the Iraqi Sand with some white. Even though the orc monsters that I did not give them pupils because the artwork didn't have pupils, it looks like the artwork for the bard actually does have them. So I'm using my Micron pen to dot in the pupils. Next, I want to add a little bit more shade to the feather. So I'm mixing some brown rose and Eldandil Violet to get sort of a darker pink color and mixing some flow aid in with that so it flows. I'm using this to kind of brush into the shadows. Now I'll highlight the gold metal with Vallejo Model Color Gold. This is a little brighter than the glorious gold that we use as a base coat, so I like to use it to highlight gold. I wanted a little more contrast between the two feathers, so I decided to go in and do some dark lining with some Agrax Earthshade. Next, we'll highlight the metal areas with Runfang Steel, starting with the handguard on the sword. And now I'm applying this to all the metal parts of the loot. Looking very closely at the artwork, it looks like the metal actually has some red stripes on it, so I'm trying to put those in with some Mephiston Red. I would definitely call this an optional step. Next, I'm mixing a gray for the middle part of the ribbon on the metal. In the end, this is barely noticeable, so I feel like it was kind of a waste of time. And as with the other heroes, I am painting the base in Hull Red. And with that, we have the completed Bard. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, please give the video a like and subscribe to my channel for more like it. You can also follow me on the other social media platforms where I will sometimes post works in progress for you. So until we meet again, happy painting.